They say that travel broadens the mind, and that's certainly true. It's good for us to expose ourselves to new cultures, or to explore lands we've never set foot on at all. For most of us, that means going on vacation. Any good vacation is a trip into the unknown, but sometimes we get more than we bargained for. A lot of people spend their retirement years traveling around the world to see the sights, and British grandmother Lamenda Kingdom is one of them. She was looking forward to taking a short break in the sunshine of Grenada in Spain, but a simple misunderstanding about spelling left her taking a much longer journey. Lamenda's travel agent misunderstood her as she tried to organize her vacation, and instead booked her on a plane to the Caribbean island of Grenada. Grenada is a beautiful place to visit and spend time, but not if your hotel is in a completely different country, thousands of miles away. She'd already enjoyed her in-flight meal before she realized she was in the wrong flight and wasn't able to get off until the plane briefly stopped over in St. Lucia. Fortunately, Avios, the company who organized the flight, quickly arranged an alternative for her and managed to get her to Grenada a day later, along with a bottle of champagne and the promise of a future free holiday. Lamenda may have gone to the Caribbean by accident, but plenty of people do it on purpose every year by booking passage on a ship and setting off to tour the seas on a Caribbean cruise. Floating on the waves on a modern cruise liner should be the peak of luxury, but if an illness breaks out on board and begins to spread, it quickly turns into a nightmare. The Royal Caribbean vessel Oasis of the Seas was in the middle of a journey through the islands when one of the passengers on board contracted the norovirus, a highly virulent sickness that can lead to chronic nausea. Because it's passed on very easily, the only effective cure was to quarantine the entire boat with 9,000 passengers and confine the 500 of them on board to their cabins until the sickness passed. The cruise liner had to send out for more doctors to be brought onto the ship from the shores, and nobody was allowed to leave until the medical professionals were satisfied that the infections had passed. If you've ever been kept waiting in an airport or a plane for too long, you'll already know how frustrating and stressful that process can be. It's even worse when there are no announcements and staff aren't explaining why nothing's happening. Despite that, we'd never go as far as this Polish gentleman did when he was trapped on the runway in Malaga. It had already been a difficult flight. The plane took off from London an hour late, and when it landed at its Spanish destination, it remained on the runway for 30 minutes, without anybody being allowed to disembark. That was all too much for this man to take, and so he opened the emergency exit and walked out onto the wing to make his escape. The stunt backfired. He was unable to climb down from the wing to the runway and eventually had to go back inside and wait with everybody else. He wasn't arrested but was expected to face a large fine, as well as a ban from ever using the airline again. The latest and best cruise ships have all kinds of safety equipment and precautions on board, but ultimately, you're still surrounded by water and one wrong step away from falling over the edge. The cruise ship has hosted its fair share of parties, and at one of them, a lady indulged in more than her fair share of cocktails at the bar. She was trying to find her way back to her cabin when she took a wrong turn and fell out of a hatch, from which the technical ladder is deployed. Miraculously, her legs caught and tangled with the mooring ropes hanging from the ladder, and stopped her plunging into the sea below. She was quickly pulled back to safety and sent to sleep her shock off in her cabin. We bet she stayed away from the bar for the rest of the trip. The London Eye is a must-see tourist attraction for anybody visiting England's capital city. It's a gigantic Ferris wheel which stands 440 feet tall, offering incredible views across the city. If you're not afraid of heights, you can take a ride and enjoy that view for a little while as the wheel slowly turns and brings you back down to the ground again. We imagine it's less fun when the mechanism fails, and you're stuck at that height for nearly 4 hours with no food or water. There were 500 people on board the structure when it ran into trouble in 2016, and with temperatures falling as day turned into night, the stranded guests had to break out the emergency supplies inside the pods to find thermal blankets to keep warm. Fortunately, technicians managed to get the wheel turning again, meaning people were brought back down to Earth inside their pods instead of having to climb down ladders. You may have heard it said that everybody on Earth has a doppelganger. That means someone who looks exactly like you is currently out there somewhere, living their own life, unaware that you exist. Who knows? Maybe they're even watching this video right now too. Most of us never meet our clones, but for these two bearded gentlemen, they found they'd booked seats next to each other on a flight, entirely by accident. Some people would have been completely weirded out by such an incident, but they both saw the funny side. They even posed for a smiling selfie, which ended up going viral when it was uploaded to Twitter. The drivers among us have probably all been guilty of entering the wrong address into our sat-nav systems before now. We follow the instructions without really thinking about it, and we end up in completely the wrong place, and we get annoyed with ourselves for making such a fundamental mistake. Imagine how angry you'd be with yourself if you made the same mistake, but you were a pilot in charge of a passenger plane. Unbelievably, an AirAsia flight scheduled to fly to Malaysia from Sydney, Australia, made a much shorter journey and touched down in Melbourne, Australia instead, because the pilot had entered the wrong coordinates into the plane's flight path computer. The crew knew something was wrong when they were in the air, but instead of accepting that a human error had been made, they assumed the system must be faulty, and so they set about trying to fix it. That just made the issue worse, and so they decided to land in Melbourne like the computer wanted them to. The 212 passengers on board weren't impressed with their detour, and AirAsia have subsequently upgraded all of their flight computers, so this can never happen again. When you've named a ship after a member of the British royal family, and that royal has turned up to launch the boat in person, you should probably take extra care to make sure it's in perfect working order before it leaves port, because otherwise it's embarrassing for everybody. Unfortunately, somebody let the side down with the 140,000-ton Princess Royal. The Duchess of Cambridge herself was present at the launch of the cruise liner. Unfortunately, it was beset with plumbing and electrical problems from the moment it set sail, resulting in a 12-day luxury cruise being cut short after just 1 week, and the 3,500 passengers on board being stranded for hours in Mykonos when the mechanism used to lift the anchor completely failed. When they eventually started moving again, the lights all went out and the air conditioning shut down. Ships of this size have backup generators on board in case of emergencies, and they were enough to get the essentials working so the vessel could crawl back to port. But it's safe to say the voyage didn't exactly meet with the royal standard. If the price of your vacation seems too good to be true, you should always take the time to reread the information and make sure you're getting what you think you're paying for. Dutch student Milan Schipper dreamed of visiting Sydney in Australia and seeing the famous opera house with his own eyes. He'd thought he'd found a bargain price for his flight, but when he touched down, he found it wasn't as warm outside as he expected it to be. In fact, he landed in the middle of a blizzard in Toronto, and then noticed his connecting flight was a tiny Air Canada plane. Toronto isn't exactly on the way to Australia from the Netherlands, so he double-checked his ticket with airport staff and found that he was heading to the tiny fishing town of Sydney in Canada's Nova Scotia region, not the Australian city. The friendly staff helped him make his way home to the Netherlands, and Milan says that when his father collected him from the airport, he laughed all the way home. London isn't the only city where you can get stuck on a Ferris wheel. 8 young people in Rennes, France had a New Year's Eve to remember when they were trapped on a big wheel that had been installed for the festivities for 8 hours. They climbed into the pods for a ride at 8:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve, but couldn't be reached until 5:40 a.m. on New Year's Day. The wheel in Rennes is 170 feet high, much smaller than the London Eye, but doesn't have anywhere near the same level of safety provisions. Also in this case, technicians were unable to get the wheel moving again so a helicopter rescue team had to be dispatched to get everyone safely back down to Earth. Flying to the wrong location because you've made a mistake with your tickets is one thing. Ending up in the wrong place because the airline has made an incredible error is quite another. Sandy Valdiviso and her husband, Triet Vo, were trying to fly from Los Angeles to Dakar, a city in Senegal on the African continent. Somehow, Turkish Airlines confused the 3-letter code for their destination airport with one for an entirely different location, and they ended up in Dhaka, Bangladesh instead. The code for the airport they wanted to go to is DKR. The Bangladeshi airport is DAC. Tired after a long journey, the couple fell asleep on the flight and didn't realize anything was wrong until they woke up in Asia. The airline quickly booked them onto a follow-up flight to the correct destination, but it took 2 more days for them to receive their luggage. The Swiss Alps are a dream destination for skiers. But anytime you intentionally travel to an area where the snow falls heavily, you run the risk of becoming stuck. In early 2018, more than 13,000 tourists found themselves stranded for days after the heaviest snowstorm the region had seen for more than 30 years. Because of the thickness of the snow, train lines and roads were cut off, meaning nobody could enter or leave the Swiss town of Zermatt, where the skiing enthusiasts had gathered. Rescue workers had to cut through walls of snow 23 feet thick to get the roads open again so people could make their way home. The tourists couldn't even ski to pass the time. The blizzards resulted in the risk of avalanche being set to severe for the first time in a decade. They may have been disappointed, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.